84,000 people remain under evacuation orders and warnings in New South Wales. Major flooding is expected at Singleton in the Hunter region. Areas around Coffs Harbour, Port Macquarie and Kempsey are also on high alert. The Bureau of Meteorology is warning of dangerous and life-threatening rainfall this afternoon and evening.
That's very much where we're expecting the focus of the rainfall to be today. Over the last 24 hours, we have seen numerous sites from Coffs Harbour down through the Manning into the Hunter district see rainfall totals above 100 millimetres, and some have seen close to 170, 180, particularly up on the northern part of the mid-north coast.
As the severe weather system moves to the mid-north coast, the Prime Minister has announced new disaster recovery payments for flood-affected households and businesses. Today, he and the New South Wales Premier received a briefing from emergency services before visiting flood-hit areas to hear from locals. Let's go live now to Julia Bradley, who is in Richmond. And how has the PM's visit been received by locals, Julia?
Well, Andrew, we did see one frustrated local in Windsor, which is just near where we are now in Sydney's northwest, confront Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet while they were meeting with volunteers at a local charity, Hawkesbury Helping Hands. Now, this charity is all about packaging up donations from Coles and Woolworths and collecting food for flood-affected residents here in Windsor. But what we saw was one Windsor flood victim by the name of Scott Hinks confronting the leaders and saying that while he's happy with their renewed collaboration, much more needs to be done to prevent disasters like this from happening again.
This happened 3 months ago, and everyone was talking about fixing the same problem. It's all on the radio, but nothing happened. So from our point of view, like when I go back home, we've tried ringing up local government and state government. No one's going to help me clean up. Out the backyard, I've got chemical containers that have floated in. I've got wood, I've got chairs that have floated in. But I'm going to bear that responsibility and that cost. You will speak to it, you will speak to the council, and that's the problem. There's a lot of speaking happening, but this is where this time with the Hawkesbury, we're a bit over. We need action.
As you said earlier today, the Prime Minister announced even more funding for flood victims who've been affected by this flooding disaster, and that is for residents who are in those 32 local government areas that have been declared disaster zones. So this disaster recovery payment, it includes $1,000 payments for eligible adults, $400 payments for children, and there's also allowances for employees and sole traders who have lost their income because of this disaster.
I'm very pleased that the Commonwealth is cooperating so well with the New South Wales Government. It is a seamless relationship that we have, which is what people want to see at a time like this. And this morning I can announce that the Australian Government has approved our disaster recovery payments to kick in from 2 o'clock tomorrow for the 23 local government areas.
Authorities are warning that the flood threat is far from over in these communities in Sydney's northwest because it's going to take an incredibly long time for floodwaters to recede, with major rivers like the Hawkesbury likely to remain at a major flood level for some time.
But I remind the community that it does take a while for these waters to flow and recede from the significant high levels that we've had over the past few days. It will be a while before a couple of days before the bridges come back out in the Hawkesbury and Nepean area. And I remind the community that people have to get in, our engineers have to get in, make sure that those bridges are safe, but also there will be expected significant damage to our roads.
So as things start to calm down where I am now and residents wait for floodwaters to recede, the danger is really shifting further north to areas like Hunter and the mid-north coast, with Dominic Perrottet, the Premier, warning that there's a significant risk of flash flooding in areas like Singleton. Those regions are about to cop a whole lot of rain. Andrew?
Thank you, Julia. We'll talk to you soon. Well, Anthony Albanese has made it clear he's blaming the Sydney floods on climate change. He says this is why he is acting on Australia's emissions target and why the world needs to act. It is the clearest statement on this front from the federal government yet.
What we know is that Australia has always been subject of floods, of bushfires, but we know that the science told us that if we continued to not take action globally on climate change, then these events, extreme weather events, would be more often and more intense. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that play out.
The PM was also on the attack earlier today when it came to Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor suggesting he should have called Premier Dominic Perrottet sooner about the flood situation in New South Wales instead of waiting until he left Ukraine.
People have conflict fatigue and they don't want to see governments arguing. They don't want to see governments acting with the sort of childish comments we've seen from some of my federal counterparts in the last day, criticising, for example, me for not making a phone call when I was in the Ukraine and on radio silence without any electronic equipment. I was fulfilling a responsibility that I believe that I had of travelling to Ukraine. To compare that with a holiday is, I just find, beyond contempt, frankly.
And this is what he was referring to, Angus Taylor, on 2GB Monday afternoon.
It was flooding for 48 hours and he's only just picked up the phone to Dominic Perrottet to ask if he needs a hand. So there's 30,000 people who have been told to evacuate their homes, but the PM's more concerned about his reputation on the global stage.
New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet actually went out of his way this morning to defend the PM over his travel.
I know in some quarters the Prime Minister is being criticised for being away. What I would say is, from my perspective, the federal government needs to balance international concerns and domestic concerns. But as soon as he could, he picked up the phone to call me. I know the engagement between the Murray and Steph, the federal and state emergency service ministers, has been strong from the outset. As I said, Murray is the first emergency service minister from a federal perspective who has come to Homebush, where we stand up SEOC, and that's incredibly important.
The New South Wales Premier also seemed to make it clear that he prefers his relationship with Mr Albanese on some of these issues to that of his relationship with former PM Scott Morrison, even though Perrottet and Morrison are both Liberals. Morrison and Perrottet had several arguments while Perrottet was Treasurer and Premier over what the New South Wales Premier thought was Morrison's tendency to nickel and dime over disaster assistance. In one meeting, Mr Morrison memorably called Mr Perrottet an F-wit. Here was the New South Wales Premier today about how flood grants did not work as well as they should have in the last disaster.
I was disappointed with the pace of the rollout of the grants, particularly at the last event in relation to the Northern Rivers. My expectations were not met by the department. There were challenges in relation to the coordination between the joint state and federal payment systems because the guidelines are set together